So we are used to seeing ancient texts in translations that look like this and like this, so in book copies, and also in original texts that look something like this in the Greek or Latin. But this isn't how these texts obviously were always preserved, and this is not how they were written in the first place.
Yeah, sometimes, quite often we're used to reading texts that look like a full book or like they're uninterrupted, but sometimes there'll be editions where lines are broken off or don't make full sense and stuff like that. And that's because they come from incomplete texts, which are found on sources like papyri.
So our main sources for our ancient texts are on papyri, as Leo's just said, and also on much later manuscripts from the medieval era. So the way that we think about texts as being in book form is very much not representative of how we kind of get to that. And there is there's a big process that goes through getting the text to this nice complete edition.
Yeah, lots of ancient texts were actually found in rubbish dumps, mostly in a place in Egypt called Oxyrhynchus, which means the city of the pointy-nosed fish. And lots of these can be all sorts of different things. They can be fragments of really famous texts like tragedies, but they can also be really mundane things like shopping lists. And sometimes you'll find one on the same piece of papyrus on both sides.
Obviously, we're really lucky to have these texts remaining, and the fact they're found in rubbish dumps is really interesting because it's obviously like scraps and pieces that we have to put together. A lot of the time they come from Egypt because this is where they have dry, arid conditions, so this is the best place to preserve these texts. A lot of texts in Rome and stuff we find because the humid conditions get destroyed. But it's also interesting to think about Egypt as being another place in the ancient world that was connected to Greece and Rome, and therefore it wasn't just those places as the centre of the classical world and where the texts that we read were proliferated. They were also in places like Egypt.
So if you look at an example of an actual papyrus, which I'm going to pull up on my laptop now, you can see that it looks nothing like a modern edition of a book. It's written on a material that's not paper, it's made from the papyrus plant, and it's written with ink, and it's really fragmented. So you can see there's lots of holes, some of it's falling apart, lines incomplete, some letters are really smudged. So it's actually really difficult to work out what it says, and editors and translators have spent a lot of time trying to identify the letters, identify the words, and then figure out what they mean and figure out what to include when they make a translation. So there's all sorts of decisions going on behind the process of making the text what we have today from what we found in things like rubbish dumps.
So obviously papyri are really, really useful, and they're really important to use as a source because they are the oldest evidence we have. So they go back to the closest to the original text that we have. But we also have other sources that we use to kind of fill in the gaps, because as you can see, and as Leo's just said, that papyri can be very fragmentary, can have a lot of gaps, and can leave a lot of questions. So we have different traditions. There's a medieval manuscript tradition. Monks in monasteries would be copying out their Greek and Latin texts, and those can sometimes help to fill in the gaps because they would have copied out a lot of the time the whole thing. There's also, really importantly, the Greco-Arabic translation movement, which was a big movement where a lot of Greek texts were copied into Arabic by Muslim scholars. And these sources are also really, really important because they've helped to preserve the text throughout a tradition. So we have other sources that we can use to compare, and that means we can get closer to a whole complete edition of the text. So when we're thinking about where do our ancient texts come from, we have to think about all the different sources that makes up. So whether that's the papyri tradition, whether that's scholarship in the Islamic world, there's loads of different sources that go on to create a text, and it's really important to be aware of that when reading text, both in the original and in translations, that there is this kind of ambiguity, and there can be questions about what the text actually says and what Euripides or someone actually wrote. So you have to just be aware that there have been choices that have been made by scholars, and they've made their editions with their own choices. So it's good to be critical of what you're reading and to have a look at different copies and different translations, as well as, if you can work in the original, having a look at what different papyri and different manuscripts say about the different words.